Welcome to Psych Sundays. Today, we're going to be talking about 3 reasons why you may not be improving in Brawlhalla and analyzing them using some psychological theories to see what we can learn. The things I'm going to be talking about are called heuristics, I think is how you say it. These are essentially shortcuts that our brain makes to simplify things and use our energy efficiently, but it often creates problems because the shortcuts may not be correct lines of thought. So the 3 we're going to be talking about today: loss aversion, cognitive dissonance, and confirmation bias. I know, big words. To be honest, I don't really know what they mean. So I have to put this disclaimer here because, again, these are some psychological terms and heuristics that you would learn in an introductory psych class, but there's some important things to note here. Number 1, I am not an expert, okay? I just took the class and I enjoyed it, so I wanted to share what I learned with you all, in case you may enjoy it too. Number 2, psychology is a field aiming to scientify the mind, which is something that is ultimately kind of impossible at its finest level, because there's things that we just can't measure or test at all. It's an incredible area to study. It's what I'm interested in it. That's why I'm making these streams and these videos out of it, but remember its limitations, right? And then the third thing is that these examples, I mean, I'm using Brawlhalla analogies, they're just kind of for fun, so they might not be the most detailed, and in a vacuum they make sense, but you gotta remember in the real world things are a little more complicated. There's probably multiple explanations, multiple conclusions for everything, so I would just recommend to pay more attention to the general ideas rather than the minute details of everything, and then you can try and recognize when you run into them in your everyday life. So, let's start. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is loss aversion, which I'm sure you've heard of it before, but in case you haven't, here's the definition from the APA, American Psychological Association: the tendency to go to disproportionately great lengths to avoid perceived losses, which is basically saying that we hate losing, so we do a lot of things to avoid it. And the key here is disproportionately. So we do things to avoid losses that do not match up to how bad the actual loss is. So a classic example to demonstrate loss aversion is the coin flip test. So this is something that people have tried out in various scenarios to see how much the disproportionate fear of losing really is. So they're asked, if a coin lands on heads and you will lose $10, how much money will it take for you to gain if it lands on tails, for you to actually do the coin flip, for you to actually take the bet? And on average, the amount is $20. Let me switch over to a different color here so that makes more sense. Which, if you think about it, is kind of crazy. The amount to win has to be double the amount to lose for it to feel worth the risk in your mind. This is not proportionate whatsoever. It's a 50-50 chance. If you think about it logically, it should be $10, but it's not. We hate losing. So, if we bring it over into Brawlhalla, now scientists may have found this new record-breaking, really devastating drug known as copium that I think plagues the community left and right, and really every online community, including every in-person community as well. So maybe we can recognize, like, yeah, losing hurts more than winning feels good. Like, that kind of makes sense. We can think of examples where that adds up, but like, why is that? Well, most likely, if we think about it, it's probably an adaptation to survive. So if losing hurts more, you're less likely to take a risk where you might lose or something bad might happen, and then you're less likely to also run into it again, right? So if we're talking about humans surviving in the wild, then yeah, you probably don't want to go into the tiger cave. Do tigers live in caves? Bear cave? Cavern? Because you might die. So another example for this, of this losses tend to hurt more than winning feels good, and I think this really demonstrates the disproportionate amount that it does, is when you're riding a bike, right? And you get into a bike accident and you break your arm, you're like really scared to ride your bike again. Like, you don't want to ride your bike again because you remember the one time you fell more than the like 3,000 times you didn't. And so you're like, I don't want to bike. I'm not going to bike anymore. No, I'm not going to bike. I'm not going to bike. I mean, you can bike. I'm not going to bike. Even though you fell one time out of like 3,000. It's disproportionate to the actual reality, but that's how the brain processes it, right? So let's take a look at Brawlhalla then. Because losing really sucks, you know? And the thing about losing, though, is that it's 50% of every game you play. Someone will always lose, and it's inescapable that that someone will often be you, you know? No one will always win forever. So what happens in our mind when we lose, or like when we're about to lose? Why is losing such a strong motivator, but also something that makes us feel paralyzed? Well, if we think about that through the lens of loss aversion, then that makes perfect sense. Because losing is such a huge consequence, we tend to do things to escape the consequence and protect ourselves. And that's where the copium comes in. There's a couple things that often happen. I categorize them by escape and by rationalization. There's probably more things that you could talk about, but one example is when you lose, you don't want to put yourself in the position where you could possibly lose again. So what do? Well, you stop trying. You go into experimental. I'm not going to take this seriously anymore. I'm not going to play my main anymore. All these different things that make the consequence of losing lower. Another thing is that you try harder. So it's the reverse, right? Instead of going, oh, you know what? I don't care about this game anymore. You're going to sit forward in your seat, go full gamer neck, start really try-harding. And in the process, you often end up giving up the benefits of losing, which is to say that if you're always playing not to lose, then you're never going to learn really, because you're only focused on the present moment instead of looking forward towards long-term growth. Another thing that we do is we rationalize. So if you tell yourself you didn't actually lose, if this is 2v2, it was your teammate's fault. If it's League, your teammates were inting, all right? If it's a battle royale, it's the other 99 players' fault. If you don't let yourself lose, then you never have to accept the fact that you lost in the first place. This mentality of losses being unacceptable is the single largest common factor that I see when people can't seem to improve. And nobody is immune to this. I mean, like maybe Buddha, your Prince Siddhartha under the Bodhi tree, but I experience this all the time and I know how much of a setback it can be. So if you experience it, you shouldn't feel bad about yourself because literally everyone does it. The players that are the most successful are the ones who can curb it, recognize when they're starting to run from a loss, or when they're starting to rationalize that they didn't actually lose. But everyone does it still, because it's a natural result of our human evolution. It's our brain's biology. It wants to run away from losing. So if you do recognize that, don't beat yourself up about it, right? Just try to think about why those thoughts are creeping up. And the more responsible you feel for your own losses, the more you can use them to grow. The way our brain works is 99% on autopilot, because that's efficiency right there. If you had to learn how to tie your shoes every time you put on shoes, if you had to learn how to write every time you write, or walk every time you walk, you would not be able to function. Our brain runs on autopilot for almost everything, and these heuristics is a perfect example of that. Our brain is making shortcuts to make life easier for us, but it makes life harder in a lot of situations. The good thing is that by actively thinking about it, what you're literally doing in your mind is using higher processing to regulate lower processing. Because lower processing is your automatic habits. It's the stuff that's in animal brains. But the actual frontal big brain cortex human wrinkly, that's the good stuff. That's able to plan, critically think, all things that are important towards growth. So if you can snap yourself out of it, you can literally break your mental, okay? But in a good way. The point is that if you focus on it, you can change the way that you're thinking, you can rewire those thoughts, you can repurpose it towards a positive direction, and ultimately, you can grow. The second heuristic I want to talk about is cognitive dissonance, which is a big word. There's this Festinger guy, I think Festinger, someone told me how to pronounce it last time. I actually did a project in high school about him, so if you guys want to see that on another week of Psych Sundays, I could do that. That would be maybe interesting. But the idea of cognitive dissonance, again, here's the APA definition, but it's basically to say that when we experience inner conflict, we hate it, and so we have this intense drive to fix it. That's pretty much it. And so there's this very, very classic experiment that I will walk you through now. So there's two groups of people, Group A and Group B. Both of them do the same task, which is basically either pushing a button or turning a knob for an hour. And they're told it's for some technological experiment or something like that. I don't actually remember. But the point is that it literally does nothing and it's extremely boring. And it sucks and it's cringe. But afterwards, they get paid, which is kind of cool. Except Group A gets paid $1, which is not very cool. Group B does the same thing and gets paid $20. So the question is, who enjoyed it more? I think logically, you would think that it's group B, right? The group who is paid more, you're like, oh yeah, they probably enjoyed it more because they were paid enough. Group A wasn't paid, so they're like, I'm not going to do this again. But fascinatingly, group A is the group that said they enjoyed it more, and not only that, that they would do it again. And why is that? The members of group B basically got paid $20 an hour, which is not bad, right? But for group A, the compensation for their time was pretty bad. So their mind starts like running circles, right? The gears start turning and it goes like, that was pretty cringe, okay? Did I really just spend an hour doing that for $1? No. That wasn't boring. I wouldn't do that. It was actually kind of fun. You know what? I enjoyed myself. I would do it again. So they had to tell the next person that they enjoyed it. And then the people that were paid $1 were like, after they were interviewed about lying, they were like, oh yeah, no, I actually did enjoy it. Because it wasn't enough justification, not only to justify them doing like still something extremely boring for an hour, but also for lying. I'm kind of poking fun at it, but I think it's a cool example to demonstrate how when there's this inner conflict, our brain jumps through hoops to try and fix it. So using this theory of cognitive dissonance, or this idea, how does this apply to Brawlhalla? Well, if we remember the first category, which by the way is so perfectly organized, whoever made this, good job. Oh yeah, thanks man. What creates inner conflict, right? Losing. Losing creates a lot of inner conflict. It's uncomfortable. We don't like it at all. And so if we think about in terms of cognitive dissonance, when we experience that loss, like what do we want to do? We want to fix it somehow. We want to say, no, I didn't lose. They were just spammers. Because losing would mean that I'm a bad player, but I'm not a bad player, so it must be a problem with BMG. And so this is another example of us doubling down on our beliefs to protect our ego. We can look at it as an escape or a rationalization, because that's a way out for our brain to fix that conflict. And so if we think about, again, loss aversion, this is something that can influence the next thing we do. If you lose right here, and losing is really bad, then of course you're going to want to escape, and of course you're going to want to rationalize. It makes perfect sense. So what I want to say about cognitive dissonance is, if you experience and you notice those, what am I doing? Those feelings of being super uncomfortable, instead of trying to divert your attention and redirect elsewhere, recognize that that's what your mind wants to automatically do and let it in, you know? Let the feelings in. Think to yourself, wow, I did lose. Maybe I am a bad player. And once you do that, you realize that, hey, maybe that thought actually isn't so bad. What these things do, these automatic shortcuts that our brain takes is make us think that these perceived realities is the only possibility for how we can live our lives. But it's not true. That's not the reality. It's a shortcut. It's a bias that our mind is making. And if you recognize it and you break it down, it short circuits like that. It's like, wait, if I don't need to run away from losing anymore, then I don't need to escape. I don't need to rationalize. If losing is okay, then there's no inner conflict. So the third thing I want to talk about is confirmation bias. Now, I think this is probably the thing that people are most comfortable with. Even so, I'll give a quick definition. Again, here's the APA thing. The idea is that we tend to look for or pay more attention to things that confirm what we already believe, and we can often look past things that challenge those beliefs. But here's the thing, right? So we often think about confirmation bias in terms of like political research and stuff. It's like, oh yeah, I'm only looking for articles that I believe in, you know? If I'm not gonna read this other article that doesn't, or that goes against that. The sneaky thing about confirmation bias, and where it actually is kind of scary, is when you don't notice that that's what's happening, right? Like when we're passively paying attention or believing things that already align with our preconceived notions. Like I think we can kind of recognize when we're actively searching for things that we want to see, but when it's happening and we don't know, it can be a little bit scary. So here's an example I made, not based on real life, by the way. You believe that someone like doesn't like you. You think that they think you're annoying, and like they don't want to be around you, they don't want to talk to you, and so you text them, and then they don't text you back. And so your brain is like, see, they don't like me, I was right the whole time. But the thing is like, that's not something that you want, right? Like you're not actively searching for reasons for them not to like you. You're probably passively doing it, but it's like, you don't want them not to like you, you would love for them to like talk to you back, but this is the thing that your brain does oftentimes. So I'm sure if you're seeing this trend, right, you may be able to see what I'm going to talk about in terms of Brawlhalla. So there's two categories that I kind of recognize in myself, so there's probably a lot more, But here's where I notice confirmation bias coming to haunt me. The first example is when it can get in the way of my own growth by getting caught in the same loops of thought. So here I have two examples. I suck against Lance. Lance is broken. This is the belief that you have, which may be well-founded. And then you get destroyed by Lance. And so you're like, see, like this isn't fair. BMG, fix your game. I keep losing to Lance. This sucks. The second example is I suck against Lance. Lance is super broken. Same thought. You're going in with the same mentality, but you win against the Lance player. And then your brain goes, wait. No, I only won because they were bad. Lance is still broken. They just weren't abusing it hard enough. They were still spamming. They just weren't spamming hard enough, which is why I was able to win. But think about that. Like, that's kind of crazy, right? Because these are the complete opposite examples, and yet they end up in the same place. Here's another example. When you start to make assumptions or you're distracted by other players' actions because of these preconceived beliefs you have before going in. So if you're playing the game, right, you're queuing up ranked, and you always taunt at the start of the game, you're like, woo! And then they hit you when you're taunting, or they didn't taunt with you. And then you go, they're a toxic player. And you get really upset. That's kind of strange. Because think about it, like, you don't know anything about the other player. What if they're just wanting to play quickly? What if they want to grab the weapon? What if they have their taunts unbound? What if they're practicing a very specific combo? The same example is like if you're playing in experimental and they're jumping so much, right? They're inputting really fast. They're doing all these complex combos. They want to be Sandstorm so bad. Just go into ranked if you want to try hard. But what if that's just how they play? What if that's just what they want to do today? What if that's how they have fun? Like, you just don't know. But because you get caught up in these thought loops all the time, it doesn't open up the door for all those different possibilities. So a lot of this is that we don't want to face the uncomfortable, right? Confirmation bias exists to maintain a status quo for us, to make things consistent, to keep our worldview consistent, because challenging that all the time is tiring. And again, if you remember cognitive dissonance, it is extremely uncomfortable. You do not want to experience that. So, like, why do we do this? If it can be so damaging or it can get in the way of things, like, why is it something that we do? Well, it also helps us a lot. There's biological reasons for it. There's a literal part of our brain, I won't get into the biology too much because it always bores people, but like, there's a part of our brain that's primary function literally exists to maintain status quo and do what we've always done because it's kept us alive. Because if you're thinking evolutionarily, the only thing that matters is staying alive, because if you've lived up to this point, then that is a huge success. And so if you just keep doing that, you have the highest chance of surviving. So changing things is super, super hard for our brain. So things like confirmation bias exist. And when we categorize it into like specific terms like confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance and like loss aversion, right? It puts it into these baskets that make it sound really scientific. But if you think about it behaviorally, it makes a lot of sense, or it's more easily applied to everyday life, right? Like when you feel uncomfortable, you don't want to feel uncomfortable anymore. That makes perfect sense. This is just more taking a psychological approach to it. The three takeaways I want to say from this, or for each of the three categories, is that, first of all, it's very hard to challenge all these heuristics, whatever you want to call them, because it's literally fighting against your brain's default processing, the thing that it's always done for not only most of your life, but most of human evolution. So it's difficult, and you gotta really logically think it through. But not only that, invite in the uncomfortable emotions. So it takes two different approaches, right? And doing different ones at different times, and letting yourself fail and accept that sometimes you are gonna feel really terrible and you're gonna want to avoid a loss, and that's okay. Just try not to do it all the time. That's totally cool too. So the TLDR is that loss aversion can help inform us why losses are so terrifying and why we act in certain ways to avoid them. The way to try and amend that and try and help that is recognize that losing is okay. It's a natural result of growth, and it's one of the fastest ways to figure out what you're doing wrong and how to improve. Because if you lose a game, you can say, oh, I did that wrong, or I did that wrong, or I did that wrong, and this is how they beat me, or this is how they countered me, or this is how I failed to counter them. If you have those moments, then you can take those as learning opportunities. But if you never let yourself lose by always rationalizing other reasons why, because they were spamming or they were playing Lance or Hammer and Scythe is broken and BMG needs to fix Greatsword before I play ranked, then you're never really going to be able to grow. For cognitive dissonance, it's important to remember that inner conflict creates an impulse to protect ourselves, to protect our ego. And so the way to help with that is to invite it in. all those thoughts that make you uncomfortable, accept them and say, hey, you know what? Maybe if I face you head on, you're not as bad as my mind makes you seem. So someone in chat was asking earlier, how can I know if I'm doing the right thing? How can I know if I'm making excuses for myself? One of the things that I recommend is to go in the opposite direction of what you want. If you're feeling extremely uncomfortable when you lose, then go in that direction and try and let in those thoughts of uncomfortability. And I don't know if that's a word, but let in those thoughts of, okay, maybe I'm not a good player. Like maybe they really did beat me. And maybe I really do suck, and maybe I do need to improve on this. And when you stop skirting the responsibility and letting in the uncomfortable suddenly isn't as bad. But if you always chase logic and you can always run from the loss, the things that are most comfortable are probably going to be the things that you've been doing, right? So it's not about doing it all the time, you know, take it in little chunks, but try and just see what happens when you do that, because I think it'll change a lot. So yeah, if those thoughts make you really sad and they make you want to give up, then that's also something to think about. Think about why you want to give up, why it makes you so sad. And if you can kind of process that, and not only that, but let yourself feel the sadness, then I think you'll recognize that maybe it's okay if you never reach your goals, which may sound crazy, but maybe it's fine. And maybe if you realize it's okay to never reach your goals, you're gonna blow your goals out of the water, because you're no longer tied down by the thought of failing. You're only looking forward to the future. So confirmation bias can help explain why we sometimes get caught in thought loops, and we're always in the same, we're not malleable, we're unchanging, and so one of the things to do is to challenge your beliefs. Try and let things in that you wouldn't normally accept or think about, and if you can do that, then you can expand your toolkit, right? If you're always using a hammer and you're always using a saw, then you're not going to be able to screw in a bolt. Is that a good analogy? I don't know, but that makes sense to me. I guess if I'm going to sum it all up, the whole idea is that there's a lot of things we do to escape not just losing, but things that make us feel uncomfortable in general. Thoughts that are uncomfortable, feelings that are uncomfortable. And there's a lot of reasons why. You can take a lot of different approaches to analyze it. I just wanted to share 3 terms that I thought were interesting. But again, the terms are hyper-specific and the examples are pretty general. So it all depends, you know. Not everything is cognitive dissonance and not everything is confirmation bias. But they are kind of trends of human behavior that kind of exist everywhere. So the idea is that the reason why we do this is for our brain to help us. You're not doing something wrong. You're not stupid. You're actually functioning incredibly normally and also very high functioning. It's extremely adaptive. It's helpful. Just not for every situation. So take it in chunks. Take it slow. Recognize that it's okay to fall short. It's okay to fail. It's okay to lose. And I guess best of luck on the battlefield. Hopefully this wasn't like depressing. It might have been a little bit. But also try and notice these things in your everyday life because you might be able to improve areas there as well. So I hope this was interesting. I hope it was helpful and not depressing. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you next week. Oh, also the first person to guess next week's topic gets a gifted sub. So do that.